The year was 1718. A merchant vessel sat dead in the water off the Carolina coast, her sails slack, her crew pressed against the rails in absolute silence. No one spoke. No one moved. What was approaching from the windward side defied every assumption they had carried into that morning about what a ship could look like, what men could be. The vessel coming toward them was enormous. 40 cannons. Black flag climbing the mast in slow, deliberate ceremony. Torches burning along the bow in broad daylight, not for light, but for meaning. And the man at the helm, silhouetted against the sky already going the color of old blood, was someone whose name had traveled ahead of him like a plague. The merchant crew surrendered before a single shot was fired. They would later testify, in a deposition that still exists, yellowed and precise, in the colonial records of North Carolina, that they had expected to die. They had prepared themselves for it. Men of their experience knew what pirates did to crews that resisted, and they had decided not to resist. They expected chaos. They expected savagery without structure. They expected the random, howling violence of men who answered to nothing. What they found instead was something that took them years to fully articulate. The pirates who boarded their ship were operating under a contract. A written, signed, witnessed, democratically ratified contract that governed every decision, every punishment, every share of plunder, every vote cast aboard that vessel. Who stood watch at which hour? How disputes between crewmates were settled? What happened to a man who struck another man without provocation? What happened to a man who brought a woman aboard against her will? What happened, and this is the part that the merchant crew could not stop talking about in their depositions, to anyone who abandoned the fight? The punishment for breaking this code was not a fine. It was not a reprimand. It was death, or something close enough to it. The survivors wished they had chosen death instead. There is a specific kind of violence that history commits against complicated truths. It simplifies them until they become comfortable. The Golden Age of Piracy, that extraordinary, blood-soaked flowering of maritime outlawry that ran from roughly 1650 to 1730, has been simplified into something decorative. Flags and rum and theatrical cruelty. A costume party with cannons. The reality was a political revolution conducted at sea by men who had nothing left to lose. To understand what the code actually was, you have to understand what these men were escaping. The Royal Navy and the great merchant trading companies of the early 18th century were not employers in any modern sense. They were systems of organized human disposal. Sailors were impressed, which is a polite historical word for abducted, from port towns across England and the colonies. Men were taken from taverns, from their homes, from the streets, handed a biscuit and a rank they had not requested, and told to die efficiently in the service of men who would never trouble themselves to learn a common sailor's name. A naval captain's authority was absolute and legally codified. He could flog a man for speaking improperly, for being slow, for looking at an officer with insufficient deference. He could order 50 lashes and watch it carried out and eat his dinner afterward without legal consequence of any kind. Desertion earned a hanging. Insubordination could earn 100 lashes, delivered publicly, before the entire crew, not merely as punishment for the individual but as a lesson written directly onto the bodies of every man who watched. This was not the distant past. This was the living present for every man who eventually turned pirate. They did not romanticize their escape. They built an alternative. When sailors mutinied and seized a vessel, the first order of business, before charting a course, before celebrating, before anything, as the articles. Different crews called them different things. Ship's articles. The agreement. The code. But the function was identical across dozens of documented pirate ships spanning 3 decades of the Golden Age, to establish, in writing, the terms under which every man aboard would live, fight, profit, suffer, and if necessary, die. These documents survived. Not all of them, but enough. Historians have studied them with the same care they bring to constitutional texts, because in a very real sense that is what they are. Bartholomew Roberts was, by the cold mathematics of ships taken and cargo seized, the most successful pirate in recorded history. Between 1719 and 1722 he captured more than 400 vessels, a number so large it strains credibility until you trace the documented accounts one by one. He operated primarily in the Atlantic, raiding from Newfoundland to West Africa. And he did it under articles so specific, so rigorously detailed, so carefully enforced, that the legal scholars who later examined them used words like constitutional without apparent irony. Every man aboard his ship signed the articles before they sailed. Every man knew them. And every man had been told, clearly, what awaited anyone who violated them. Article 1 on Robert's ships established voting rights. Equal voting rights. Every crew member, from the most experienced gunner to the newest recruit who had come aboard 3 days ago, had one vote on major decisions. Whether to attack a target. Where to sail next. What to do with a prisoner who had shown particular courage in defense of his ship. Whether to accept a ransom or burn a vessel to the waterline. The captain held a second vote only in cases of absolute deadlock. Let that resolve into focus. In 1720, aboard a vessel sailing under a skull and crossbones in the mid-Atlantic, a common sailor's vote counted the same as the captain's. The captain himself, on most pirate ships, was not an officer in any traditional sense. He was an elected position. He held his authority conditionally, by ongoing consent, and he could be removed by vote at any time for any reason the crew deemed sufficient. Cowardice in battle. Incompetence in navigation. Cruelty that exceeded what the articles permitted. He could be voted out before breakfast and replaced before lunch. This was, by any honest definition, democracy, operating in the Atlantic Ocean in the early 18th century, on vessels that the most powerful empires in the world had officially classified as enemies of all mankind. But democracy without enforcement is just a conversation. And the men who wrote the pirate articles understood this with the particular clarity of people who had already seen what happened when the powerful operated without accountability. They built enforcement into the code with a specificity that reads today as almost bureaucratic. On Robert's ships, any man who deserted his post during battle would be killed or marooned. Any man who brought a private candle below deck, a fire risk that could kill everyone, would receive a punishment the articles described without sentimentality. Any man who defrauded his crewmates of even a modest sum would have his nose and ears slit open and be put ashore, alive but permanently marked, his crime written on his face wherever he went for the rest of his life. Any man who violated a female prisoner would be put to death. Not flogged. Not marooned. Death. Specified in writing. Agreed to by the whole crew before they sailed. And on the question of gambling, of all things, the articles were nuanced in a way that reveals how carefully these documents had been thought through. Gambling itself was not prohibited. But gambling that produced violent disputes between crewmates was treated differently. Men who had a grievance were separated, brought ashore at the next opportunity, and allowed to settle it between themselves with whatever weapons they preferred. One-on-one. On land. They had, embedded in their criminal constitution, something functionally identical to a formal grievance process. The quartermaster was the figure who held the code together in practice. On legitimate naval vessels, the quartermaster was a subordinate officer answering upward to the captain. On a pirate ship, the structure was inverted entirely. The quartermaster answered to the crew. He was their elected representative, their advocate in disputes with the captain, their judge in conflicts too minor for a full crew vote and too serious to ignore. He also controlled the plunder. When a ship was taken, the quartermaster, not the captain, supervised the inventory of seized goods. He calculated shares according to the articles everyone had signed, and he distributed them publicly, so that every man could see that no one was receiving more than their agreed portion. Surgeons received a fixed share. Carpenters received a fixed share. The cook, often a man who had lost a limb in battle and could no longer manage rigging, received a fixed share, because the articles accounted for what men could still contribute even when their bodies had been permanently altered by the violence of their profession. And for the men whose bodies had been altered, the articles went further. Compensation. Specified in advance, in writing. So many pieces of 8 for a right arm lost in service of the ship. A lesser but still substantial sum for the left arm. Specific amounts for an eye, for a leg, for a finger. The exact figures varied between crews, but the principle was consistent across dozens of documented vessels. If you were maimed while serving the code owed you something. Workers' compensation. In 1700. On a pirate ship. Written into a contract that every man had read and signed before it was ever needed. When the code was broken, and it was broken, because human nature does not become orderly simply because a contract demands it, the consequences were administered It's a formality that is deeply strange to contemplate. There were trials. Not always, and not with the elaborate procedural theater of legitimate courts. But often enough, and with enough consistency across different ships and different crews, that the pattern is unmistakable. The accused was brought before the assembled crew. The accusation was stated. Evidence was presented. The accused was permitted to speak. The crew voted. The process took minutes, sometimes. Occasionally longer. But it happened. In 1720, a man sailing under Edward Lowe, a pirate whose documented cruelty was severe enough to disturb even his contemporaries, which by the standards of that era means something, was caught stealing from the collective plunder. The trial was brief. The verdict was not. It was unanimous, and it was arrived at without the chaos that might have attended such a proceeding under other circumstances. They marooned him. Marooning deserves more examination than it usually receives, because it is easy to hear the word and picture something almost peaceful, a man left on a beach. The reality was designed to be understood as a death sentence with a very particular psychological dimension. The condemned man was put ashore on the most barren, isolated strip of land available. He was given a pistol with a single ball. A bottle of water. His clothes. The pistol was not for self-defense. There was nothing to defend against. The pistol was an acknowledgment, formal, almost courteous, that death was coming, that the condemned man would know it was coming, and that he was being extended the mercy of choosing how quickly. Most men didn't use it. They walked the shoreline instead, searching the horizon, eating whatever the island offered, drinking their water in careful rationed sips, and waiting for a sail that usually never appeared. The records that survive, from men who were eventually rescued, from sailors who found remains, suggest the waiting lasted days, sometimes weeks. He code had given the condemned man a choice, and the choice itself was part of the punishment. Blackbeard operated under articles. This is not speculation, it is documented. Edward Teach, whose biography remains partially obscured by the legend his own theatrical genius constructed around him, was many things, but he was not lawless in the sense that word is usually applied to him. He had a crew under contract. He had a structure of authority that the crew had ratified. He had rules. The burning fuses braided into his beard. The sulfur smoke he ignited around himself before boarding a vessel, so that he appeared to materialize from a cloud of foul-smelling darkness like something produced by hell rather than by a mother in Bristol. The careful, deliberate architecture of a reputation so terrifying that ships would strike their colors, surrender, at the sight of his flag, before he had fired a single shot. This was not chaos. This was strategic. Blackbeard understood that fear was more efficient than combat. A crew that surrendered intact cost no lives and no powder. A crew that had to be overcome by force was expensive even in victory. He was, beneath the theater, a businessman operating under a contract. When he died in November of 1718, ambushed by Lieutenant Robert Maynard in the waters of Ocracoke Inlet, shot 5 times and stabbed more than 20 times before he finally fell, his crew did not scatter into panic. They fought. The articles required it. They fought because the code said they would fight. The British Crown's decision to systematically destroy the pirate republic at Nassau in the Bahamas was not primarily a law enforcement action. It is described that way in official documents, and historians have sometimes accepted that framing uncritically. But the internal correspondence, the letters between colonial governors, between admiralty officials, between the merchants whose ships were being taken, reveals a different understanding. What Nassau? You represented, by 1717 or 1718, was a functional alternative state. It had an economy. It had a population. It had a recognizable system of justice. Men arrived there from across the Atlantic and the Caribbean, drawn not merely by the prospect of plunder but by the prospect of living somewhere that had agreed, in writing, that their lives had value. Woodes Rogers, sent by the Crown in 1718 with a royal pardon in one hand and a naval squadron in the other, understood his mission precisely. The pardon was offered first because hanging men was expensive and created martyrs. But the men who refused the pardon, and significant numbers did, were hunted with the full resources of the British state. The executions that followed were not merely punitive. They were architectural. The bodies of hanged pirates were left in cages of iron, gibbeted, over Nassau Harbor, over the ports of Charlestown and Boston and London, until the flesh was gone and the bones fell apart in the wind. Visible from approaching ships. Visible from the wharves where sailors worked. Visible to every man who might be considering, quietly, that another system was possible. The code had to be answered with a code of its own. The Empire understood this. The scientific and sociological explanations for pirate democracy are not wrong, precisely. They are just incomplete. Self-interest explains some of it. A ship with no system of internal justice destroys itself through conflict before any external enemy can. Voting rights keep men loyal. Compensation schedules attract skilled specialists who might otherwise stay with legitimate shipping. The articles made practical sense. But practical sense does not explain everything that is in those documents. It does not explain why compensation schedules went as far as they did, specifying different sums for different fingers, accounting for the difference between a lost eye and a lost hand, treating the granular details of human bodily damage with a thoroughness that went well beyond what was operationally necessary to maintain crew cohesion. It does not explain why voting structures were designed to be slow and deliberate rather than efficient. Democracy, even rough democracy, costs time. A captain who could decide alone could decide faster. The articles chose not to optimize for speed. It does not explain. In the treatment of African crew members, which on many documented pirate ships included full shares and full votes in a period when the entire legal and economic infrastructure of the Atlantic world was organized around the premise that men of African descent were property. The Widow's Crew Manifest, from Samuel Bellamy's ship, which sank in 1717 off the coast of Cape Cod, shows a crew of roughly 150 men, approximately a quarter of them of African descent, all operating under the same articles, receiving the same shares, casting the same votes. None of that is explained by self-interest alone. Something else was present in those documents. Something that does not have a clean name but that anyone who reads the actual articles, rather than summaries of the articles, can feel. A conviction. An insistence. A refusal to accept the terms that the world had offered and a decision to write new ones. Bartholomew Roberts died in February of 1722, shot through the throat by grapeshot from HMS Swallow in the waters off West Africa. His crew, in the hours immediately following his death, did not attempt to flee or negotiate. They were under articles. The articles specified behavior. But before the surviving crew were taken prisoner, they did something that was not strictly necessary and that every subsequent account notices. They dressed Roberts in his finest clothes. They placed his weapons in his hands. And they threw his body into the sea before the Navy could reach it, so that his corpse could not be gibbeted, could not be displayed, could not be made into a lesson for other sailors watching from other wharves. It was a funeral. Conducted under fire. In accordance with the values the articles had established. The Navy took the remaining crew to Cape Coast Castle, where 52 men were tried. 52 men who had signed the same articles, who had voted under the same code, who had lived by the same principles of radical equality that the most powerful empire on earth had spent 4 years trying to extinguish. 17 of them were acquitted. 35 were convicted. The ones who were convicted were hanged in groups, their bodies arranged in the harbor the same way bodies had been arranged in Nassau and Charlestown, and every port where the empire needed to make its argument visually, undeniably clear. The code says this. Our code. Not yours. The Golden Age of Piracy was over by 1730. The last significant pirate fleets had been broken. The Republic of Nassau was gone. The articles that had governed it were scattered, some preserved by the courts that had used them as evidence of criminal conspiracy, some surviving in the depositions of merchants and sailors who had encountered the ships that operated under them, some lost entirely. And yet something did not disappear. The ideas that those articles contained, that authority must be consented to, that rights belong to men regardless of their station, that the governed have the right to remove those who govern them, that even the most dangerous work in the world entitles a man to compensation when it breaks his body, those ideas appeared again. In pamphlets, in arguments, and documents written by men who may or may not have known where they had first been tested. The most equitable system of rights operating in the Atlantic world in the early 18th century was not in any parliament. It was not in any court. It was not produced by any of the men who are remembered as the architects of civilization. It was on a pirate ship, written in rough ink, signed by men who had been told their lives were expendable, enforced without mercy against anyone who violated it, because the men who had built it knew, from direct, bodily experience, what happened to people whose rights existed only in theory, with no structure to make them real. The code was real. The democracy it created was real. The rights it guaranteed were real. And the system that could not tolerate they. Our existence sent warships and gibbets and iron cages to ensure that you would remember the pirates as criminals rather than as what they actually were. Ask yourself what that system was afraid of. And then ask yourself what it is still afraid of.